The first sound I heard wasn't music. It wasn't conversation. It was chairs. More than 200 chairs scraping back across the marble floor at the exact same time. The sound cracked through the room like gunfire. Conversations died mid-sentence. A fork slipped from someone's hand and hit the floor. No one bent down to pick it up. A server crossing the ballroom froze in place. Even the band forgot what song they were playing. I had just stepped through the doors. Just stepped in. And then the entire room stood. A Navy commander near the entrance snapped to attention. He drew in one hard breath. Then his voice rang out so loudly, even the crystal chandeliers above us seemed to tremble. "Admiral on deck!" The silence that followed wasn't ordinary silence. It was the kind that makes you suddenly aware of your own heartbeat. Near the drink station, a startled server dropped an entire tray. Glasses crashed together. Water spilled across the marble, but no one turned to look. Not one person. Every eye in that ballroom was fixed on the same place. Me. I stood there without moving. The white dress uniform on my shoulders suddenly felt heavier than it had a second ago. 200 Navy SEALs, officers, veterans, all of them standing at attention. Some saluted, some only stared. But every face carried the same thing: respect. I looked across the room, and then I saw my mother. She was standing beside the wedding cake, one hand still wrapped around a champagne glass, the other pressed against her mouth, like she had just witnessed something she couldn't explain. Then I saw Melanie. My younger sister stood frozen beside the groom. Her bridal bouquet was still in her hands, but her fingers were gripping it so tightly, a few petals had already started to bend. And then I saw my father, Harold Bennett. The man who had texted me less than 24 hours earlier. The man who had written, "Nobody cares about your Navy career. Don't embarrass this family by wearing that uniform." He stood there now, silent, motionless, staring at me like he was seeing a stranger for the very first time. I had imagined this moment thousands of times, maybe tens of thousands. During my years at Annapolis, during every trip back home, during every short phone call, during every family dinner where no one wanted to hear about my work. I used to think that if this day ever came, I would feel victorious. I would feel satisfied. I would feel like everything had finally been proven. But when the moment actually happened, I didn't feel any of those things. I just felt tired. A deep kind of tired. I looked at the people standing in front of me. Then I looked at the father who had needed more than 30 years to truly see me. And the first question that crossed my mind was, what does any of it matter now? I was 58 years old. A Navy admiral. I had commanded ships, made decisions that affected thousands of lives. And yet, standing there in that ballroom, I felt a lot more like a 17-year-old girl. The girl sitting in a small kitchen in Charleston, listening to her father say, "Girls don't belong on warships." There's something strange about getting older. Your body changes, your hair changes, you gain experience, you learn things you never knew before. But some wounds never seem to age with you. They just sit quietly in the dark, waiting for the right moment to wake up again. I knew that feeling well, because throughout my career, I'd met a lot of successful people. Admirals, pilots, doctors, business owners. And the thing that always surprised me was how similar they really were. Most of them had stopped trying to prove themselves to the world years ago. But deep down, they were still carrying one person with them. One person they had once hoped would say, "I'm proud of you." I never told anyone that. But standing in that ballroom that night, surrounded by chandeliers, polished marble, and the soft clink of glassware, I finally realized something. This had never been a story about rank. It wasn't a story about medals. It wasn't even a story about the Navy. It was a story about a little girl who spent more than 3 decades trying to be seen by her own family. And the ironic part was, outside that room, plenty of people knew exactly who I was. Officers knew me, senators knew me, the men and women who had served beside me knew me. But my father didn't. Or maybe, he never wanted to. I looked at him again. This time more carefully. And for the first time in years, a different question entered my mind. Not, why was he never proud of me? But why did seeing me seem to bother him so much? Because that night, for the first time, I started to wonder if the story was more complicated than I had always believed. Maybe my father's distance hadn't really started with me. Maybe it had started long before I was born, long before our arguments, long before Charleston, long before any of us. There had always been an old photograph in my garage. A photograph that had been around so long, I honestly couldn't remember the first time I saw it. In the picture, two young men stood beside an old pickup truck. Both of them were smiling. One of them was my father. The other, I never knew his name. My father never mentioned him. Not once. And strangely enough, I never asked. It was one of those unspoken Bennett family rules. Something that had always been there. Always visible, yet somehow never discussed. At the time, I didn't understand why. I had no idea that the answer to everything was waiting decades in the past. I had no idea that the man in that photograph would eventually explain almost everything. I didn't know the answers were waiting back in 1967. I didn't know that night would end on the Charleston waterfront instead of inside the ballroom. And I definitely didn't know that the next morning, my father would bring me an old box. A box that would leave both of us struggling to hold back tears. But all of that was still ahead of me. For now. I was just standing in the middle of a crowded ballroom, listening to the sound of more than 200 chairs settling back into place, looking at the father standing frozen across from me, and wondering, how had a family wedding turned into the night the Bennett family's secrets finally started coming apart? If you want to know what really happened between my father and me after that night, leave a 1 in the comments below. Because none of this actually started in that ballroom. It started years earlier. In a small kitchen in Charleston, with a 17-year-old girl who looked her family in the eye and told them she wanted to join the Navy. Standing in that ballroom that day, watching more than 200 people rise to their feet at once, I suddenly found myself thinking about something completely different. Not my graduation, not the day I made Admiral, but a refrigerator in my family's tiny Charleston kitchen. It sounds strange, but memories work that way. They don't always hold on to the moments that mattered most. They hold on to the moments that made you feel invisible. I was about 12 when it happened. One afternoon, Melanie came home with a B on a test. Mom taped it to the refrigerator. Dad stopped at the store on his way home and bought ice cream for the whole family. Melanie smiled through dinner. Everyone was happy, and honestly, I was happy for her too. Melanie was the kind of kid people naturally loved. She always knew the right thing to say, always knew when to laugh, always knew how to make people feel comfortable. But what I remember most about that day was my backpack, because inside it was another test. An A, the highest score in the class. I waited for someone to ask, for Mom to ask how school went, for Dad to glance my way, for anyone. Nobody did. After dinner, I opened my backpack, looked at the paper for a few seconds, then slipped it right back inside. No one knew. No one remembered, but one person noticed. Melanie. That night, while I was clearing the dinner table, she wandered into the kitchen with a half-melted ice cream bar still in her hand. Hey, she tugged lightly on my sleeve. You got an A today, right? I looked at her, surprised. How do you know that? She shrugged. I saw it in your backpack. I laughed softly. It's okay. She studied me for a moment, then glanced toward the living room, where our parents were watching television. Claire isn't weird, I blinked. What? She looked back at me. She just likes different stuff. She said it as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Then she ran off before I could answer. That was Melanie. Even as a kid, she never tried to hurt me. But sometimes loving someone doesn't mean you understand them. And sometimes growing up in the same house doesn't mean you grow up in the same world. Melanie belonged to a world people understood. I didn't. I liked warships, military history, spending hours down at the harbor watching ships come and go. My bedroom didn't have posters of singers or movie stars. It had maps, photographs of naval vessels, stacks of old Navy magazines I bought from a bookstore near the waterfront. I knew I was different. But back then, I didn't think different was a bad thing. Not yet. That changed when I was 15. We were at a family gathering. One of my aunts asked the usual question. So, Claire, what do you want to do when you grow up? I answered without hesitation. I want to join the Navy. The entire table went quiet, for maybe 2 seconds. Then everyone laughed. Not cruelly, not maliciously, just the kind of laugh adults give when a kid says something they don't think is realistic. My father shook his head. She'll change her mind. And that was that. The conversation moved on. As if I had never spoken. I looked around the table. Everyone was smiling. Everyone except one person, Melanie. She looked at me, then at everyone else. What if she actually does it? The table turned toward her. One of my uncles chuckled. You've been watching too many movies. A few more laughs. Then the conversation drifted somewhere else. But I never forgot that moment, because it was the first time somebody had stood on my side, even if it only lasted a few seconds. 2 years later, September 1985. I was 17. Mom was making meatloaf in the kitchen. Dad was reading the newspaper. Melanie was doing homework at the dining table. I had rehearsed those words for weeks, over and over, every possible version, every possible reaction. Finally, I took a breath. I want to apply to the Naval Academy. Mom's fork stopped halfway to the sink. Melanie looked up. Dad slowly lowered the newspaper. He stared at me for a few seconds, then shook his head. Claire. He let out a long sigh. Don't start with this. I'm serious. A dry laugh escaped him. Girls don't belong on warships. That was it. No one asked why. No one asked if it was really my dream. No one asked what made me want it so badly. The answer had already been decided before the conversation even started. I still remember standing there, heart pounding, trying not to let my voice shake. Then another voice came from the dining table. But what if that's what she wants? Melanie. Dad turned toward her. She immediately looked back down at her notebook. Didn't say another word. The conversation ended a few minutes later. But that image never left me. Because even though she couldn't change anything, she tried. That night, I sat alone on the front porch. Charleston felt unusually quiet. Far out by the harbor, scattered lights blinked against the darkness. I sat there for a long time, thinking about what my father had said, thinking about what I was about to do. And eventually, I made myself a promise. If nobody in that house believed I could do it, then I'd have to believe it enough for all of us. If nobody else believed I could do it, then at least one person had to. And that person would be me. At 17, that felt like enough. I had no idea how far that decision would carry me. I had no idea what it would cost, or how completely it would change the course of my life. All I knew was that a few months later, I would leave Charleston behind and head for Annapolis. And for the first time in my life, nobody cared whether I belonged there. Nobody cared where I came from. Nobody cared what my last name was. They only cared about one thing, one question. A question every candidate eventually had to answer for themselves. Are you tough enough to stay? And for the first time in my life, that felt like the right question. If there was one thing the 17-year-old girl sitting on that Charleston porch didn't understand, it was that proving people wrong is a lot harder than it sounds. Annapolis was nothing like I had imagined. By the end of my first week, I wanted to quit. The whistle blew before sunrise. People jumped out of bed, ran, lined up, trained, started over, then did it all again. During my second week, we had a run in the pouring rain. Water streamed down my face. My shoes felt like they weighed 20 pounds. My lungs were on fire. At one point, I bent over with my hands on my knees, just trying to breathe. An instructor walked past. He stopped and looked at me. Thinking about quitting, Midshipman Bennett? Truthfully, I was. For a few seconds, I really was. But then I thought about Charleston. I thought about my father. I pictured walking back into that house and hearing him say, "Told you so." I straightened up and kept running. That's how I survived Annapolis. Not because I was confident, because I was stubborn. I couldn't stand the idea of failing in front of people who had already decided I would. One day at a time. 1 month at a time. And eventually, I graduated. Then came the Navy. My first assignments, my first real responsibilities. The first time I was put in charge of a group of sailors I barely slept the night before. I was terrified of making the wrong call. Terrified that someone else might pay the price for my mistake. That's when I learned leadership isn't really about authority. It's about responsibility. And responsibility is heavy. During those years, I met David. David was the kind of person who made life feel quieter, safer. He loved evenings at home, long dinners, slow weekends with no plans. Meanwhile, I was always preparing for the next deployment, the next assignment, the next phone call that could change everything. For the first few years, we found ways to make it work. And most of the time, we were genuinely happy. David never asked me to give up my career, never demanded that I choose between the Navy and our marriage, and somehow that made what happened later hurt even more. One anniversary, David planned a special dinner. 2 candles, 2 plates, a bottle of wine waiting on the table. He texted me that afternoon, told me he'd be waiting. I promised I'd be home, this time for sure. Then, around 4 o'clock, my phone rang. An urgent assignment, the kind you don't say no to, the kind that doesn't care what day it is. By the time I got home, it was nearly midnight. The candles had burned down to puddles of wax. The food was cold, the wine sat unopened, and David was alone in the living room. The television was still on, but he wasn't really watching it. I stood in the doorway, not knowing what to say. "David," he looked at me for a few seconds, then nodded. "You missed it again." There was no anger in his voice, no accusation, just exhaustion, the kind that comes after being disappointed too many times. I stepped closer. "I'm sorry." David gave me a sad smile. Then he said something I've never forgotten, something that stayed with me for years. "I miss you even when you're standing right here." I remember going completely still. Because for the first time, I understood the problem wasn't distance, it wasn't deployments, it wasn't geography. It was the distance growing inside our own home. He was sitting on the couch, I was standing a few feet away, and somehow it felt like we were living in different worlds. We tried for a few more years, canceled vacations, missed birthdays, short phone calls squeezed between deployments. Neither of us betrayed the other. Neither of us did anything wrong. Sometimes 2 people simply start walking in different directions. The day we signed the divorce papers, nobody yelled, nobody argued. There were no dramatic speeches, no slammed doors. David took off his wedding ring, set it on the table, then looked at me. "I can't compete with the Navy." Those were the last words he said before he walked away. I sat in my car for a long time afterward, engine off, radio silent, just staring at the empty space on my finger. That was the first time I truly understood that every choice comes with a price. But strangely enough, the thing that haunted me most wasn't my marriage, it was my grandmother. She died while I was in the middle of a deployment. I got the call late in the afternoon. The sun was already dropping toward the horizon. I was standing alone on the ship's deck, phone in my hand, ocean stretching endlessly in every direction. There wasn't a flight in the world that could get me home in time. There was no way to say goodbye. I just stood there, watching the sun disappear into the water, knowing I would never get that moment back. The years kept moving. One mission, then another. One promotion, then another. Until eventually, that day, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. Messages poured in from everywhere. Congratulations, handshakes, invitations, people I hadn't heard from in years. But the call I waited for most was the one home. I called my father. He answered. I told him the news. There was silence on the other end for a few seconds. I remember thinking this time would be different. I thought maybe, finally, he'd be proud. Instead he said, a pause. Sounds like a lot of responsibility. Then he asked how the weather was in Virginia. As if we'd been discussing some ordinary office job. As if nothing important had happened at all. I sat there staring at my phone long after the call ended, wondering how much farther I had to go. What else I had to accomplish. How many mountains I had to climb before my own father would finally see me. What I didn't know then was that years later, that same man would send me a text message just before Melanie's wedding. A short message. Only a few lines long. But it would hurt more than a lot of things I'd lived through in uniform. It would make me seriously consider not coming back to Charleston at all. And that's where everything began to change. If you've ever felt like, no matter how hard you tried, you still weren't enough for someone, leave a in the comments below, just a single dot. And in the next part, I'll tell you about the message my father sent before my sister's wedding. A message so short, it took less than 10 seconds to read. But one that stayed with me far longer than some of the hardest days of my military career. I still remember the phone call with my father the day I made Admiral. Sounds like a busy job. That was it. That was all he said. Then he asked about the weather in Virginia. As if the conversation we'd just had wasn't important. As if nothing remarkable had happened at all. At the time, I thought I was used to it. Used to the indifference, used to expectations that never became reality, used to moving forward without hearing the one thing I wanted to hear. Turns out, I wasn't. Because years later, a single text message from him was enough to turn me right back into that 17-year-old girl. It was a rainy afternoon in Norfolk. I'd just finished a meeting that seemed to last forever. Outside my office window, the harbor was almost completely swallowed by fog. My phone buzzed. The screen lit up. "Dad," I opened the message. One sentence. Just one. "Nobody cares about your Navy career. Don't make everyone uncomfortable by showing up to Melanie's wedding in uniform." I read it once. Then again. A third time. A fourth. The words hurt exactly the same every time. I set the phone down on my desk, didn't reply. Honestly, I had no idea what to say. What surprised me most was that I wasn't angry. If that message had arrived 20 years earlier, I probably would have exploded. I would have argued, defended myself, tried to prove him wrong. But now, I was just tired. A very familiar kind of tired. Like hearing a song you've listened to for 30 years. You already know every lyric. You know exactly what's coming next. And somehow, that's the part that hurts most. I got up and walked to the window, looked out at the ships in the harbor. Then, without meaning to, I laughed. Just a little. Because over the course of my career, I'd done things most people never have to do. I'd stood in front of families who had just learned they lost someone they loved. I'd made decisions that affected hundreds of lives. I'd handled situations capable of silencing an entire room. And yet one text from my father could still drain every ounce of energy out of me. That night, I went home early. The house was so quiet, I could hear the ticking of the wall clock. I opened the closet, pulled out a suitcase, set it on the bed, then just stood there staring at it. For a long time, I opened it, packed a few clothes, then took them back out. Eventually, I closed the suitcase, shoved it back into the corner of the closet. I genuinely considered not going. Not because I was angry, because I was exhausted. Exhausted from returning to a place where I'd never felt like I belonged. Exhausted from pretending everything was fine. Exhausted from sitting in rooms where people always seemed determined to shrink my life down to something smaller. I poured myself a glass of bourbon, set it on the table, but never took a sip. My father's text was still glowing on my phone screen. I stared at it, and for the first time, I seriously asked myself a question I had spent most of my life avoiding. What if I simply stopped trying? What if I skipped the wedding? Stayed in Norfolk? Let everyone celebrate without me? What if, for once, I stopped chasing approval that was never coming? Then I flipped the phone face down, but that didn't make the words disappear. Around 8 that evening, my phone rang. This time, it was Ramon Hayes. We had served together for years. Ramon was the kind of person who didn't say much, but when he did, people listened. "I heard you're heading back to Charleston," I laughed softly. "News travels fast." "I also heard you're thinking about not going." I was quiet for a few seconds. "Maybe." The line went silent. Then Ramon asked, "You remember the first time we met?" "Of course. Afghanistan, the collapsed building, the dead radio signal." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. Ramon chuckled. "Did you run that day?" "No. Why not?" I didn't answer, because I knew exactly where he was going with this. Ramon let out a quiet grunt. "For 30 years you've shown up in the hardest places. The worst days. The missions nobody else wanted." He paused, then said, "Hell, Claire. If you survived Afghanistan, you can survive a wedding." I laughed. For the first time all day, I really laughed. Ramon laughed too. "Trust me. Some family weddings are scarier than deployments." That, I believe. We both fell silent, the comfortable kind of silence, the kind that only exists between people who've been through too much together. Then Ramon lowered his voice. "Hey, yeah? Don't let a text message make the decision for you." That one made me glance toward the suitcase still sitting in the corner of the room. Ramon didn't tell me my father was wrong. He didn't tell me to forgive him. He didn't try to turn everything into a life lesson. He simply pulled me out of the loop I'd been trapped in all afternoon. Sometimes that's the best thing a friend can do. Before hanging up, I asked him one last question. "Do you really think it matters if I go?" Ramon didn't answer right away. Then finally he said, "I think you matter." The call ended. I sat there for a long time afterward, listening to the rain tapping against the windows, listening to the clock ticking in the living room. Then I stood up, walked to the closet. Inside hung my white dress uniform, the same uniform my father didn't want to see at Melanie's wedding. I reached out and ran my hand across the fabric. This time I didn't hesitate. I pulled the suitcase back out, opened it, and started packing. I was going to Charleston. Not to prove anything, not to change anyone's mind, not to win an argument that had been going on for 30 years. I was going because I wasn't gonna let fear make the decision for me. What I didn't know then was what waited on the other side of that flight. I didn't know my family hadn't changed nearly as much as I'd hoped, and I definitely didn't know that only a few hours after walking into Melanie's wedding, an entire ballroom would witness something my father had spent more than 3 decades refusing to see. Less than 10 minutes after arriving in Charleston, I was already thinking about going back to the airport. It sounds ridiculous. After everything it had taken to get here. After the conversation with Ramon, after promising myself I wasn't going to run anymore. And yet the second I stepped out of the car, that familiar feeling came rushing back. The feeling of showing up somewhere you were never really wanted. The wedding was being held at a waterfront resort overlooking the harbor. The late afternoon sun danced across the water. Rows of white chairs lined the lawn. Soft music drifted through the air. Everything looked beautiful. But sometimes beautiful doesn't make things easier. The first person to spot me was my mother. She was standing near the guest reception area. When she saw me, she smiled, a polite smile. Not the smile of a mother seeing her daughter after months apart. Her eyes immediately dropped to my white dress uniform. "Claire." She walked over, looked at the ribbons and medals on my chest, then gently adjusted my collar. "Didn't you have something else you could wear?" I looked at her for a moment. "I thought this was fine." Mom sighed. "Today is Melanie's day." I knew exactly what she meant. She didn't have to explain. I'd heard different versions of that sentence my entire life. Don't stand out. Don't be too different. Don't make people uncomfortable. I simply nodded. No argument, no explanation. A few minutes later, my father appeared. Harold Bennett still carried that same rigid posture I'd known my whole life. He looked at me, then at the uniform. His expression darkened immediately. "So you actually wore it?" It wasn't a question. It was a judgment. "Why wouldn't I?" I asked. He shook his head. "You always have to make everything about yourself." I hadn't even opened my mouth before he added, "Just try not to make this about you." The words landed harder than they should have. Not because they surprised me, because they didn't. Some comments make you angry the first time you hear them. But after 30 years, they mostly just make you sad. For a second, I thought about responding, then decided not to, because I already knew how it would end. My father didn't actually want an answer. He wanted to be right. Right then, Melanie appeared. Wearing a white wedding dress, she looked beautiful. And honestly, I had always wanted my little sister to have a perfect day. She wrapped her arms around me, but the hug felt shorter than I remembered. "I'm really glad you came." "Me too." She hesitated, just for a second. Then her eyes flickered toward the uniform. A small shift, almost invisible. But I noticed it. Because after a lifetime in the Navy, you learn to notice the things people don't say. And suddenly I found myself wondering. Had she asked me to come because she wanted me there? Or because not inviting me would have looked worse? The thought hit harder than I expected. Not because I believed it, because for a moment, I wasn't sure. Then her eyes dropped to the ribbons and medals on my chest. I knew what was coming before she even said it. "Please, don't be upset." I stayed quiet. "Could you take some of them off?" She rushed to explain. "Just for today. I don't want people paying too much attention." Her eyes fell to the bouquet in her hands. She couldn't quite look at me. Her fingers tightened around the flowers until a few petals started to bend. I knew she wasn't trying to hurt me. That was the worst part. She was simply repeating what our family had believed for years. I shook my head gently. "I can't." Melanie nodded, but the disappointment stayed in her eyes. A little while later, more guests started arriving. I decided to move away from the family area. Not because I was angry, I just needed room to breathe. I found a seat near the back, close enough to see the water, far enough away that nobody would ask me to change who I was. One by one, the chairs around me filled. People talked, laughed, shook hands, but nobody sat beside me. Nobody seemed to notice. Except me. It's a strange feeling. You can be surrounded by hundreds of people and still feel completely alone. About 20 minutes later, I overheard a guest talking to my father. I wasn't trying to listen, but his answer stopped me cold. "So what does your daughter do?" the man asked. Dad shrugged. "Oh, she works for the government." That was it. No Navy. No Admiral. No 30 years of service. No mention of the thousands of people I'd led and served beside. Just, she works for the government. The guest nodded. "Oh." Then immediately started asking about a golf course near the resort. The conversation moved on without hesitation. As if I had never existed. As if an entire lifetime could be reduced to a single sentence. After that, I stopped hearing the conversation altogether. I just stared out at the water. And realized something. The most painful thing isn't when someone hates you. It's when they never cared enough to learn who you are. I sat there for a while longer, until I noticed something strange. A gray-haired man across the lawn was staring at me. Not casually, really staring. Then another man noticed me. Then another. At first I assumed it was coincidence, but the looks kept multiplying. Whispers started spreading. People turned their heads. A few conversations stopped halfway through. Something in the atmosphere was shifting. I didn't understand what was happening yet. But every instinct I had told me something was coming. Something big. Something that was about to change the entire evening. And in just a few minutes, the people who had spent years asking me to make myself smaller were about to see the woman the rest of the world had been seeing for decades. If you're enjoying the story, leave a 1 in the comments below, and if you're not enjoying it, go ahead and hit the like button anyway. Because the next part is the moment nobody in the Bennett family was remotely prepared for. I don't know who recognized me first, but I know it wasn't my father, it wasn't my mother, and it definitely wasn't Melanie. The first person who recognized me was a gray-haired man standing on the far side of the lawn. He stared at me for a few seconds, then set his drink down, and started walking in my direction. At that point, I was still sitting alone near the back row. The seats beside me were empty. The music was still playing. People were still talking, laughing, moving between tables. Nobody had any idea what was about to happen. The man stopped in front of me, looked a little closer, then laughed. "My God." He shook his head. "I thought I was seeing things." It took me a second. Then I recognized him too. More than 20 years had passed since the last time we'd seen each other. We shook hands, and that simple moment was enough to make a few nearby guests start paying attention. The man turned around and called to a younger man standing a few yards away. "Cole, come here for a second." The young man walked over. The older man placed a hand on his shoulder, then pointed toward me. "This is the woman I've told you about." The young man's expression changed instantly. He looked at me, really looked at me, then said quietly, "My father is alive because of you." That was all. No long explanation, no dramatic speech, just one sentence. But the conversations around us immediately began to fade. The air itself seemed quieter. The gray-haired man nodded. 2003. "You got us home." I didn't know what to say, because to me it had been a job, a difficult day, one of many, but to them, it had been the rest of their lives. I glanced toward my family. Melanie was watching now, so was my mother, both of them wearing the same confused expression. The conversation wasn't even finished when an older woman approached. She took both of my hands in hers. Her eyes were already wet. "I've wanted to thank you for years." I tilted my head slightly, trying to place her. She took a breath, then said, "You stayed when everyone else left." And instantly I remembered. A small kitchen, 2 children asleep on a couch, a long night after her husband had been killed. The woman squeezed my hands gently. I never forgot that. Then she let go and walked away. She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. When I looked back toward the family tables, I noticed my mother had finally sat down. The champagne glass was still in her hand, but she'd forgotten to drink from it. Her eyes never left me. For the first time that entire evening, she wasn't looking at the uniform. She was looking at me. I could see the confusion on my mother's face now. Not discomfort, not irritation. Confusion. A young officer approached next. He stood perfectly straight, a little nervous, like someone standing in front of a person he'd respected for a very long time. He looked at me for a few seconds, then said, "If it weren't for you." He stopped, swallowed, then tried again. "I wouldn't exist." The air around us seemed to freeze. Nobody spoke, nobody laughed, nobody moved. Even the music drifting across the lawn felt distant all of a sudden. I glanced toward my family. My father was still standing there, no longer talking to anyone, no longer looking away, just listening to every sentence, every story, every piece of a life he'd never known, or maybe never wanted to know. And then something strange started happening. Another person recognized me, then another, then another. A retired Navy commander, a former SEAL, an officer I'd served with years earlier. Whispers began spreading through the wedding crowd. "Is that Claire Bennett?" "I think it is." "No way. That's gotta be her." Conversations started breaking apart. People turned their heads. Some stood up. Others abandoned conversations halfway through a sentence. The atmosphere was changing, like the air before a storm. At first, barely noticeable, then impossible to ignore. I saw it happen in my father's eyes. The irritation was gone. The judgment was gone. That familiar expression he'd worn every time he looked at my uniform had disappeared. What remained was confusion. The confusion of a man discovering that the rest of the world saw his daughter very differently than he had for the last 30 years. A few minutes later, the staff opened the ballroom doors. Guests slowly began moving inside. The conversations softened, but the glances toward me didn't stop. A man walking through the ballroom entrance suddenly froze. He'd seen me. His eyes widened. Then instinct took over. He immediately snapped to attention. Behind him, a retired SEAL recognized me too. Then another, and another. Nobody said a word, not yet, but I could feel it. Something was building. Something larger than all the conversations that had happened outside. Something bigger than the wedding itself. I looked at my father one last time before stepping into the ballroom. His face had changed completely now. He looked like a man who had just realized he might have missed the most important thing in his entire life. And in just a few minutes, an entire ballroom would rise to its feet. A single command would echo through the room, and the Bennett family would finally witness what the rest of the world had been seeing for more than 3 decades. By the time I stepped into the ballroom, I knew something was coming. I just had no idea it would be this big. The music was still playing. Glasses clinked across the room. Servers moved between tables carrying trays of champagne. Everything looked completely normal, until the first chair scraped backward. Then another. Then another. Within seconds, the sound of chairs sliding across marble spread through the ballroom. A fork hit the floor. Clink. No one picked it up. Conversations stopped in the middle of sentences. Even the band fell silent. I turned around and saw the entire room rising to its feet. More than 200 people. Navy officers, retired SEALs, veterans, men and women who had served all over the world, every one of them standing at attention. A man near the ballroom entrance drew in a deep breath. Then his voice rang out. "Admiral on deck!" The room went silent, completely silent. And at that exact moment, the wine glass slipped from my father's fingers. Red wine spilled across the white tablecloth. The glass rolled off the edge of the table, hit the floor, and shattered. He didn't even notice. He just stood there, looking at me, as if the rest of the ballroom had disappeared. I stood frozen myself, not speaking, not moving, because some moments are so much bigger than you imagined that your mind doesn't know what to do with them. I looked toward my family's table. My mother had sunk into her chair. The champagne glass was still in her hand, but she'd forgotten to drink from it. Melanie stood motionless, her bouquet still clutched in both hands, the white petals bent beneath her tightening grip. I watched her lift a hand toward her mouth, like she was afraid she might start crying right there in the middle of the ballroom. Ethan stared at me, then looked back at Melanie. "You never told me who she was." His voice was barely above a whisper. Melanie didn't answer. She just looked down at her bouquet, as if she were seeing the gap for the first time. The gap between the story our family had always told and the reality unfolding in front of her. Then I heard footsteps. A retired SEAL stepped forward. He raised his glass, looked around the room, and said, "A lot of people here know exactly who she is." He pointed toward me. "But maybe not everyone knows why." Nobody spoke. Nobody interrupted. The man nodded slowly. I served under her. A pause. And I'm standing here today because of a decision she made. The ballroom became even quieter. The former SEAL turned toward the young man standing nearby, his son, then rested a hand on his shoulder. If she'd been 5 minutes later that day, his voice caught for just a second, this young man would have grown up without a father. No one moved, no one even seemed to breathe. Because for the first time that night, the stories were no longer about rank, or medals, or titles. They were about lives. And one by one, the people in that room were beginning to realize they had never actually known Claire Bennett at all. He paused, then looked down at the young man beside him. Then this kid wouldn't even exist. Nobody laughed, nobody moved. Even the hum of the air conditioning seemed to disappear. I watched Ethan slowly turn toward me, like he was looking at a completely different person than the one he'd met earlier that day. The man stepped back, then an older woman approached. I recognized her immediately, Michael Harris's wife. Michael never came home from that deployment. She looked at me, her eyes already shining with tears. I didn't come here to talk about my husband. Her voice trembled. I only came to say one thing. She took a breath. When everyone else left, she stayed. The ballroom seemed to freeze. The woman looked around the room. On the worst night of my life, she sat in my kitchen until sunrise. I lowered my eyes. I still remembered that kitchen. The 2 children asleep on the couch. The silence of a woman who had just lost her husband. The older woman smiled through her tears. My family never forgot that. Then she walked away. Nobody applauded. Nobody said a word. Because some stories don't need applause. They carry their own weight. A young officer stepped forward next. He stood perfectly straight, a little nervous. He looked at me, took a breath, then said, "If it weren't for her, I wouldn't be here." The room fell silent again. I glanced toward my father. By now he wasn't looking at the people speaking anymore. He was looking at me, only me, like he was trying to piece together a puzzle he'd ignored for decades. And strangely enough, I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel vindicated. I didn't feel like I'd finally won. I just felt tired. Tired that it had taken more than 30 years. Tired that it had taken more than 200 strangers to tell my family who I was. But the night wasn't over, because the thing that was changing wasn't the room. It was my father. I could see it in his eyes. The anger was gone. The irritation was gone. The judgment was gone. All that remained was confusion, and something else. Something that looked a lot like regret. As if for the first time he was wondering how many years he'd missed. How many conversations, how many moments, how many opportunities to truly know his daughter. How many times he had looked directly at me and chosen to look away. A few hours later, after the reception ended, after the guests started heading home, he would find me down by the Charleston harbor, and for the first time in my life, he would tell me a story he'd been carrying for nearly 60 years. A story that began in 1967. A story that explained far more than I was prepared for. And for the first time in over 30 years, I would finally understand why my father had always looked at my career the way he did. He took a deep breath, then let it out slowly. "I've always been proud of you." I opened my mouth, but no words came. 30 years. And it turned out the sentence I'd waited my entire life to hear was only 4 words long. The strange thing was, they were enough. I stood there, listening to the water, listening to the wind, listening to the words I'd been waiting more than 3 decades to hear. Then he spoke again, his voice quieter now, rougher. "I missed a lot of years, Claire." He paused, staring out at the harbor. "And I can't get them back." The silence stretched between us, and for the first time that night, he looked old, not because of his age, because of his regret. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel like I'd won an argument. I didn't feel vindicated. I just felt lighter, like a conversation that had been going on for 30 years had finally come to an end. We stood there a while longer, not saying much. We didn't need to. On the walk back toward the hotel, I heard someone call my name. I turned around. It was Melanie. She was still wearing her wedding dress. The wind had loosened a few strands of her hair. For a moment she just stood there. Then she said, "I'm sorry." I didn't answer. Melanie looked down at her hands. "I've been thinking about everything that happened tonight." She gave a small, sad laugh. "I grew up hearing people compare me to you." I stayed quiet. You got better grades. You were stronger. You were always the special one." She took a breath. "And I think," her voice faded, "I started believing that if you shined, I would disappear." That was the first time I'd ever heard my sister tell the truth. Not an excuse, not an argument, just the truth. I stepped forward and hugged her. Neither of us said another word. We didn't have to. That was enough. The next morning, as I was getting ready to leave Charleston, there was a knock at my hotel room door. When I opened it, my father was standing there. In his hands was a small wooden box. Old, worn smooth at the corners by time. He held it out to me. "I think it's time you had this." I looked down at the box, then back at him. For a second, neither of us spoke, and something about the way he was holding it told me this wasn't just an old keepsake. This was the thing he'd been carrying all those years, the thing he'd never talked about, the thing that started long before me, long before Annapolis, long before the Navy, long before any of the arguments, back in 1967. And somehow, before I'd even opened the lid, I knew whatever was inside was about to explain everything. But he just shook his head. "Read it when you get home." I took the box from his hands. The brass latch had darkened with age. As I turned it over, something caught my eye. 2 initials carved into the lid. T.W. Tommy Walker. I looked up, but my father had already turned away. No explanation, no story, no final speech, just silence. I had no idea what was inside, no idea why he'd kept it hidden for so long. But for the first time in years, the distance between us didn't feel quite as wide. When my car finally pulled away from Charleston, I glanced back through the window. My father was still standing on the sidewalk outside the hotel. He didn't wave, didn't call after me, didn't try to stop the car. He just stood there, hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket, looking exactly like the man I'd known my entire life, except for one thing. For the first time, I knew he was watching me leave. Not looking past me, not looking away, watching me. The city slowly disappeared behind us, the harbor, the hotel, the wedding, all of it fading into the distance. But the wooden box remained on the seat beside me, and every mile I drove, I found myself glancing at it, at those 2 initials, T.W., Tommy Walker, the man in the photograph, the name my father had never spoken, the name that had somehow shaped an entire family without anyone realizing it. I didn't know it yet, but inside that box was the beginning of a story that started in 1967. A story about friendship, loss, regret, and a promise that had survived almost 60 years. A story that would finally explain my father, and maybe, for the first time, allow me to understand him. If you'd like me to continue Claire's story, uncover what's inside Tommy Walker's box, and tell you what happened next, leave a 2 in the comments below. Because sometimes, the real story doesn't begin with an apology, it begins with what comes after.